Hi, everybody. My name is Philip. I'm one of the founders of Climatic, and I'm thrilled to welcome Rainer and Max to the session. I couldn't really be more excited to have these two guests with us here today. Please ask any questions in the chat, and we'll answer them there. To say a few words about Rainer and Max. Rainer is the Global Director for IT Sustainability at Siemens. I think he has now over 20 years of IT experience. And I think as we discussed prior to the session, Rainer, quite a long-standing passion for the environment. And Rainer and his team focused on ways to unlock sustainable solutions within IT infrastructure for Siemens. Max is the founder of the Sustainable Digital Infrastructure Alliance, or SDIA, and they're working on meeting the rising demand of the digital economy with a new generation of infrastructure. He's an expert on software architecture, technology, and cloud infrastructure. So I think, as we know, emissions from cloud computing are big, but they're sometimes a bit underappreciated, although I think that's shifting. There was recently some reports around video streaming, and I think the Carbon Trust estimates that about 55 grams of CO2 emissions are emitted per hour of video streaming in Europe. But cloud computing is obviously a very big issue in general. There's been a study done by the Shift project. I think that's a French group, and they're estimating that the ICT sector's carbon footprint increased from 2.5% to 3.7% of global emissions, and about 20% of these 3.7% come from data centers and 16% from network operations, and the rest consists of hardware production and terminal usage, which I know, Max, you're quite an expert on. So these 3.7%, that's actually more than flights. We all talk about flights, which is about 2.4% of emissions being harmful, and they are. But cloud computing is increasing year on year and now uses over 45, this is what I read earlier to the session, over 45 terawatt of electricity. That's 1.8 of US energy just in the US. That's about the same as New Zealand. And these emissions are predicted to increase by 6% year on year. So it's still pretty hard, I think, for companies to understand what emissions their IT operations or their cloud operations or cloud computing are actually generating. And why is this? I think this is partly, in my view, through lack of transparency. So how do you see this, Rainer?
Coming back to that, I mean, the transparency is key. And at the moment, we don't have that because, from my point of view, at least the big ones still haven't got the message which is behind and the requirements which are coming from customers. I'm very much pushing them as much as I can. I'm just putting the power of the company I'm working for in my back, which mostly at least convinces a couple of people to at least listen to me and listen about the requirements. But with the example I just gave with our cloud migration project, we still had to use data, or we are proud that we are able to use data from Climatic to do that comparison in a trusted way, in a way which is then really a comparison and not a fundamental, which we've got just from the providers. And just one last word, exactly as Max mentioned, just the wording itself shows that there is not the right understanding. If you ask one of the providers, it's green electricity, and they include nuclear, and the other ones are talking about a renewable energy, which has not the nuclear power included. So there is already a different type of understanding. Well, you can surely discuss about if nuclear is a green electricity or if it's not, but from that perspective, it's just not a clear standard which has been defined, and we're not talking about the same thing if we're talking about sustainability and renewable topics.
Maybe, yeah, I completely agree with you, Rainer. I like that you look at it like this, and that you have a mature understanding of it works. I do want to be a bit defensive of the the cloud the cloud providers in itself, because what we are asking them to do, right, to attribute resource and power consumption directly to the unit I'm using or the computation, is technically the opposite of what this whole paradigm of cloud is about, right? It is about complete abstraction of resources. And we have done this for the last 2 years to figure out how to actually do this, like to actually measure power consumption and resource consumption of the underlying assets. And it's really hard, I have to say. So I think I don't want to put them on the wall and say they're not trying to be transparent. I think they're having a hard time releasing the right data. And I think what they may be afraid of, and what they shouldn't be afraid of, is to release the totals. So they just want to break out, the numbers per customer. But I think what in the sense of and for the sake of transparency, it would help to also release the totals, right? So that we can actually really say the digital economy has a footprint of X. Um, yeah, that
Makes
just
sense.
a little bit of defense. It's not that simple to just to just say like, oh, here's the data.
Yeah.
Agreed.
No, that makes sense. I mean, Rainer, when as you try to optimize for efficiency and reducing emissions, what are some of the key lessons that you've learned, in the years at Siemens and even before in doing that?
Well, first of all, we have to always look close in regard of usage and the software itself, because I mean the hardware can be as much energy efficient as the software is treating it. So if you do have software which is idling all the time and only used, I don't know, once per day, once per week, once per month, and the software itself is not developed in a way, or the code itself is not developed in a way that it's possible to maybe put that self into a container, for example. And containering, I think, is one of the biggest opportunities we have in that remark. To allow the hardware which is below, even if it's a virtual machine, to be completely powered off as soon as it's not required to be used. Then I think we have to have a deeper look into systems which are indeed just not used anymore. I mean, this is something in especially big enterprises like we are. There is dozens of people who are just firing up a system in a sandbox and trying to work on something and trying to start a project, and then it's forgotten about. And we just identified at the beginning of our migration scenarios hundreds of servers which had been still kept up and running. And I mean, again, and I agree with you, Max, it's not about bullshitting the cloud providers. They are making money out of that. So they are not interested in telling us this is a service you don't operate anymore with. They just keep them up and running because that's their business. So that's totally fair enough. But from a energy consumption point of view, the first thing we can do is power them off, and right sizing then goes into the next direction. So at the beginning, most of the systems are over dimensioned because everybody thought like, well, we need to have that, and you never know, and better go with a double amount of CPUs and RAM. But right sizing then helps us a lot to bring, first of all, the energy consumption down. And this is one of the outcomes in general from IT and sustainability. A lot of sustainable solutions are increasing the efficiency or lowering the energy consumption, therefore lowering the cost as well. So it's always a misunderstanding that sustainability within IT is always creating cost, but not any kind of beneficial situations. But it is beneficial from a cost perspective then mostly as well. I mean, if you just think about shutting off servers, right sizing them, it brings down the cost then as well in the right way. So therefore, this is always a good argument.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I think I love that Rainer, it's really the first time I have to say that somebody really gets these things. I don't have that very often in these kind of discussions. I like that you say right sizing. I do. There's an issue in that, right? So from a cloud perspective, if I own my own data center or my own IT infrastructure, it's much easier. But in the cloud, there is a disincentive that's a bit. I think that was not intended by the cloud providers, is that all of a sudden they're making more money from your inefficiency, because the underlying infrastructure can actually solve these inefficiencies itself by compressing your machines into another machine and just oversubscribing the servers. But they're all of a sudden, you're right, they're not making they're making less money if you shut down something. And I think the cloud was originally created from a science perspective and from a tech perspective to increase efficiency, and now it's become a business game, right? It was about selling Amazon's spare capacity, right? And now they're building dedicated data centers just for AWS, which I think is counter to what the cloud was all about, which is to use resources that would have otherwise been wasted. And I think we're moving into it got businessified, and Rainer, I think your observations are spot on. Is that it's now become a business case to sell you more services to make sure you don't turn anything off, and that's completely counterproductive to sustainability.
Yeah, it's a bit like, turning the light bulb off when you leave, right? in a similar way. Housekeeping, except that oftentimes it's not visible, right? You don't see it when it's running. It's a bit different from normal housekeeping. Yeah, I totally agree. I guess I have two more questions. One is like, what are as you try to understand your footprint within an organization, and Max, I know you worked with some organizations as well. How do you normally go about this? Like, how do you get your readings, mostly accurately? What are the sort of the challenges and the approaches you took?
I would say, Rainer, I'm very curious that you answer this first to see how you did it. If you don't want to talk about that, I can give a very I can give a very detailed answer on that.
Now, let me come up from the customer perspective as an enterprise first, maybe, and that is exactly how we started it. I mean, I just turned out to the big ones, and with the expectation that I'm running up a already known aspect and asking a question which can be answered already. But exactly as you said, as I came with a question, how is the footprint of the services I'm hosting within your cloud, and this is hundreds of thousands of services, I never got an answer. And then the next step had been to try to get anything which is then to be used in a raw data format, which can be put into a dashboard on ourselves to make comparisons between. Because even if in the meantime, at least two of the three big ones are providing data, they don't do that openly. They just provide that in own type of sustainability calculators, in own type of dashboards where you don't have any kind of expert opportunities of those data. So this led to automatically the requirement to have something like climatic to be used in an independent way, and this is how we've done it. So we just took the invoices, and this is now telling the secret to the providers how we do it. We just get the invoices, which already has the information which is required in regard of CPU and RAM and size of the systems. Combine that with the REST API of Climatic and put the numbers behind, and have then the location data as well in consideration, because this is and to be honest, the most surprising to me at the beginning, that there is so much of a difference between the data center locations. If you compare, I mean, it does make sense from just a pure temperature perspective. It does make sense that the data center in maybe, I don't know, Orlando, Florida, which has the need to be cooled down 365 days per year, is with a way higher consumption and carbon emissions than one which is in Canada or in Norway. So from that point of view, we took all of that and did put that into consideration with then the independency. And by the way, in the meantime, I'm not interested anymore in getting data from the big service providers, from the cloud providers, because I do have the opportunity to calculate it independent. And I can rely on that data because it's science-based, it's comparable, it's apples and apples. And I don't have to deep dive into the measurement, into standardized ways, how they might have done it and how they probably provide the data, and then always have to come up with three different type of dashboards. I'm just taking all the data, put it into my own surrounding, into my own data lake, and work then from their point of view. But this was now from the enterprise perspective and from my view, but I think you do have the more science-based view.
Yeah, I think I have more the engineering answer to that. So your approach is spot on. I think that's how most organizations are tackling this problem right now, right? The only data point you have is how much money you spend on which machine, right? And so we can make some assumptions about the machine. I we can do that as well. We kind of skipped that step because we knew that other people will do that, and obviously we're an NGO, so we're trying to create stuff that other people can use. For example, Climatic can implement later on as a different API, which is really figuring out the power consumption and embodied carbon of the actual machine, which is it's again, I said it already, it's not easy. There's multiple ways you can do it. There's through the server, which the cloud provider does not let you do that. But then there's also ways around the server. So through the actually plug where the server is plugged in. And there is a lot of, let's say, non-hyperscalers, non-free providers that are much more open to trying these things, right? It's not that there's an entire sector that is committed to complete in transparency. There's, let's say, also European actors that are much more keen to help and that see the engineering challenge of, oh, how do we actually make that work? And so yeah, even though we don't disagree with the approach that is made, we all know its limitations, and we're trying to develop the open source tools that enable you to measure real power and the real facts, and then convert that with whatever logic you want to convert that into carbon. But we want kilowatt hours because ultimately, again, with green certificates, with different compensation schemes and offsets, you can play with the CO2 numbers quite significantly, and then you have to agree on who compensated how and how was it reduced. But power consumption IT doesn't lie. So there, it if a server consumes 3 kilowatts, that's 3 kilowatts, and that's a number that I, as an IT person, I can say, well, maybe I can turn on echo mode in the server so the power consumption gets a little bit more flexible when I'm not using the CPU. And that's I think the tooling that developers and the software community are currently lacking to actually improve their applications to use less power. And the EU Commission people always remind me, at the MEPs, they say like energy efficiency is the primary principle of the European Union. We want to use less power. That's the number one principle, not just make all the consumption green or carbon neutral. We want to use less. And so to use less, you need to know how much am I using. And that's the paradigm that we're working towards.
So, Max, on that, so my last question, I guess, would be then, what do you think that the one, two, three things are that a developers can do to actually reduce their footprint? So, Rainer, you already talked about switching services off, identifying servers that just run in the dark, and you talked about finding the regional providers and working with them. Max, what are other things that are really easy steps to do?
Yeah, I think really easy. Go to Rainer and support him. That's the first one. The second one is go to your procurement team and say, hey guys, stop buying new servers. We're gonna run these servers until they die. And also demand from the manufacturers to stop making the firmware obsolete and things like this, because servers work for 10 to 15 years without performance degradation. It's ridiculous that we're buying new ones every 3 to 5 years, and they're also not getting faster. So leave the assets that you have, right? Lifetime extension, really, really important. And then, the third one is, for now, I would say demand transparency. So demand transparency from the infrastructure, that you know how much resources your software is consuming, so that you can then actually make improvements. Very, very simple. But without data, I think it's very difficult to make these assessments. Is this application better than the other? And that's not the point. It's about reducing resource and energy consumption.
And I would like to just add two additional topics to what Max just already said. And I think one of the things is what, Max, you mentioned at the beginning, and this is, don't forget about the people, because it's always about mindset. It's about the awareness of what's going to happen, and just changing your personal perspective on what used to be and what comes now in the future. If you take the example of developers had been trained for the last decades to focus on cybersecurity, to focus on efficiency in regard of performance of the application, and to put as much user centricity into it as well. But this brings up now a need for a additional value and additional perspective, which is the sustainability aspect, and that sustainability aspect needs to be changed in their minds as well. So the mindset shift is one of the aspects, and the other one I would like to bring up is put the pressure onto the vendors, exactly as Max said. I mean, the business of the vendors currently is to sell new products every 2 to 3 years, but this needs to change. I mean, the topic of refurbishment in regard of reusing equipment, reusing hardware, raw materials, all of that needs to come into their mindsets as well. And they need to have the pressure, and they need to feel the pressure, in particular from the enterprises. To be honest, I was struggling for a long time if I'm working for an enterprise and if that's the right thing to do, because I mean, working with a lot of passion sometimes collides with then the business perspective from an enterprise. But on the other side, the pressure I can put onto vendors, onto service providers, being such kind of a part of a huge enterprise is enormous. And they listen. They listen if you just try to tell them what the perspective is, what the ambitions are, where the company is striving for, what the enterprise is striving for. They listen. And they need to understand that they have to change the way they do business by today. Exactly as Max already mentioned, we have to use everything longer. We have to make it not just a 3 to 5 year decade, 3 to 5 year cycle usage. We need to make that a decade usage cycle, and then have to think about what's been happening afterwards. So this is two additional ones.
I think, Rainer, thanks for the addition. Just to give a funny example, because it's important that we laugh a little bit more. It's a very serious business that we're in, and I think we don't laugh enough. It works for swap feeds, right? So you can have bicycles as a service. They keep owning the bicycle and they keep repairing it. And why doesn't that work for a server, right? So swap server, and as a service works for startups. So I think look, I think circular economy means also turning a lot of things into services, and that's a good thing. You can make more money actually at the end of the day. So shouldn't be so hard.
And you're right, we need to laugh more. It's hard times in those challenging times anyhow. If you just look around in the world, what's happening, and read IPCC reports and see what's going to happen in the Ukraine and everywhere. It's hard times to laugh, but it is important to laugh because it is required to be, I think, positive in that regard. And we do have a lot of opportunities. It's challenging times, but very, very strange times as well to work on things like this. So therefore, I'm looking forward to.
Absolutely. Well, super. We're out of time, and because we had some technical issues, and don't think we have a lot of questions. But thank you so much for making time to speak about that. I thought that was really good, and we went really deep into some of the topics. So thanks a lot. Really appreciate your time. We'll publish this recording after and let you know afterwards. I think we've learned a lot about easy steps we can do both on pressuring providers, but also operational things we can do to reduce our footprint, and a bit about best practices as well, and things to think about. It's not just electricity, but it's also servers and how they live. So thanks very much for that. Good. I think that's it.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Philip. Thank you very much for connecting. I mean, joining forces is always my motto, as you know, and this was now establishing a new connection, at least to Max. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to meet you here. So therefore, perfectly well. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Great.
Yeah, thank you also for hosting, Philip. Well done.
Good. Thank you.